Imagine the world falling quiet around you, the room dim, your breath softening, and your mind beginning to drift. And in that quiet space, picture a door tall, ancient, and impossibly heavy, set deep within the heart of the Vatican, a door that countless pilgrims have walked past without ever knowing what lies behind it. Tonight, we gently step toward that hidden threshold together, not to expose scandals or chase conspiracies, but to trace the quiet, often invisible lives of the popes they rarely speak of, the forgotten shepherds, the reluctant leaders, the men whose stories were soft, edited, or simply allowed to fade into the shadows of history. You'll notice, as your breath settles, that history feels different when told slowly. The past becomes quieter, almost like a dream you can walk through without rushing. And in this dream, the Vatican becomes not a place of controversy or noise, but a dim candlelit corridor, a world of parchment, whispers, and worn sandals on old stones. Before we begin this journey, if you enjoy soft, slow history, told in gentle detail, you can take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Only if you truly want more nights like this, more calm stories, more drifting through time, and as always, tell me in the comments, what time is it right now for you? And where in the world are you listening from tonight? Settle in, because our walk through the Vatican's forgotten past is just beginning. Imagine yourself walking through the Vatican long before sunrise. Not the Vatican of cameras, crowds, and ceremony, but the Vatican as it existed centuries ago, when the world was quieter, the air cooler, and the responsibilities of a pope were far less grand than what most imagine. The halls feel almost endless, lit only by small pools of warm oil lamp glow. The stones beneath your feet hold a faint chill, as though they still remember the night. And somewhere deep inside the palace, beyond the grand chambers and ornate frescoes, a man stirs from sleep. A pope, but not one of the famous ones, whose names echo across history. Not the powerful reformers, nor the controversial figures, nor the legends of medieval politics. No. This is one of the quiet popes, the kind history often lets slip into silence. You can picture him rising slowly, the way anyone might rise when the day ahead feels heavy before it even begins. A wooden bed, a linen sheet, a small desk that holds a quill, an ink jar, and a single candle burnt halfway down. Outside the window, Rome is still in its early hush. No tourists. No modern noise, only the soft murmur of wind slipping between rooftops and the distant clatter of someone opening a stable door. This forgotten pope, whether it was a man from the 900s, or the 1400s, or even the 1700s, begins his day not with grandeur, but with ritual. A quiet prayer, spoken more to steady his own mind than to impress anyone listening. A few sips of watered wine. A slow walk to the small private chapel where the air always smells faintly of old stone, candle smoke, and polished wood. And as he moves, you begin to understand something that history books rarely show. The papacy, in daily life, was often overwhelming. Not because of power, but because of responsibility. So many forgotten popes carried the weight of entire kingdoms on their shoulders, yet lived their lives in patterns of quiet repetition. They met messengers in dim rooms, reading letters carried across mountains on horseback, trying to interpret the needs of distant lands. They listened to disputes between bishops, problems that might seem small to us now, about land boundaries, disagreements over local customs, yet were enormous to the people involved. Their days were long, not because every moment was dramatic, but because every decision affected millions of people who would never know their name. You might imagine that a pope's meals were grand banquets, but many popes, especially those the world forgets, ate simply a bowl of chickpeas softened in broth, a piece of bread that had cooled since morning, a small plate of figs, if the season was kind. Food was not meant for pleasure. It was fuel between responsibilities. Some popes, especially in the earlier centuries, even practiced regular fasting, believing that the discipline helped keep the mind clear. And around them, The Vatican felt strangely alive, but quietly alive. Servants walking on soft leather slippers so as not to disturb anyone. Scribes dipping quills in ink with slow, careful rhythm. Monks chanting in distant corridors, the sound echoing lightly like wind through a long hallway. Every sound seemed to have its own place, its own rhythm, as if the entire palace breathed slowly in unison. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the forgotten popes often welcomed pilgrims or diplomats. But don't imagine grand halls filled with trumpets. Imagine instead a small chamber, its walls lined with shelves of a single window letting in a thin stripe of daylight, a wooden chair that creaks softly as someone sits. Diplomatic conversations in those days were not fiery debates. They were slow, careful, cautious exchanges where every word mattered. And because many of these popes did not appear in political textbooks or dramatic documentaries, their diplomacy was often understated. They negotiated peace between small city-states. They calmed disputes between monasteries. They arranged for the copying of precious manuscripts before they did. Small acts that may not have shaped continents, but quietly shaped people's lives. When late afternoon arrived, the palace took on a different tone. The sunlight slanted across marble floors and softened every edge. Pigeons landed along the rooftops, settling in for the evening. And the popping out tired, in a way only long responsibility can cause, would retreat for a short moment of stillness. He might walk through the Vatican gardens, the older gardens, the ones few speak about now. They were less manicured than today, filled with the scent of herbs, earth, and damp leaves. Olive branches rustled gently, catching the last warm glow of the day. Somewhere, a fountain bubbled softly, its echo calming in the enclosed courtyard. In these moments, you can almost sense the weight slipping from his thoughts, replaced by a quiet, reflective peace. Evenings were rarely free. Letters continued to arrive. Messengers from far-off kingdoms brought news of famine, war, or dispute. Some days, the Pope might spend hours simply reading reports, marking sections with a small line of ink, thinking carefully about how to respond. Scribe after scribe would stand by, copying letters into official record books. And through all this, the world outside continued in its own rhythm. Rome settling into evening, families lighting lamps, merchants closing their shops, the distant sound of a cart rolling over cobblestones. But inside the Vatican, the responsibilities remained constant, steady, like a river that never stopped flowing. You can imagine the quiet exhaustion that came with it, a kind of stillness, not heavy, not dramatic, just constant. And yet, many of these forgotten popes carried their role with a sense of gentle humility. They did not seek to change the world. They tried simply to serve it. Some popes would write in their personal journals at night, not confessions of grand ambitions, but simple reflections. How the weather felt, the difficulty of a particular decision, the memory of a childhood moment. These writings, when they survive, offer a deeply human glimpse, one that often never reaches popular history books. As night deepened, the Vatican grew quiet again. Lamps flickered in long hallways. Pages of parchment dried in the scriptorium, filling the air with a faint smell of ink. Guards at the gates shifted their weight, fighting off fatigue, and the Pope, retreating into his chambers, would extinguish his candle with a slow breath. His day ended not with ceremony, but with a silent hope that tomorrow's burdens might be lighter. Even though he knew they rarely were. What remains, when you look back at these forgotten figures, is not the sense of power that modern imagination assigns to the papacy. Instead, it is the memory of quiet perseverance, of men who lived in long corridors of responsibility, who moved through days filled with careful decisions, small rituals, and gentle reflection. Their lives were not dramatic epics, but slow, steady journeys within the walls of one of history's most symbolic places. And as you picture the Vatican settling into stillness, stone cooling, lamps dimming, voices fading, you may begin to feel your own breath softening too, matching the rhythm of an ancient world easing into night. If you let your mind drift for a moment, imagine a small stone hut on the side of a quiet mountain. The air is thin, cool, and still. Moss grows along the edges of the stones, and a gentle wind slips through the pines, long before the Vatican bells knew his name, before manuscripts recorded his reluctant rise, before the idea of papacy ever entered his quiet thoughts, there lived a simple hermit. His name was Pietro da Moroni, and one day, much later in life, he would become Pope Celestine V. One of the most unusual, reluctant, and quietly tragic popes in history. But in the beginning, his world was the mountain, a small fire, a wooden stool, a life of silence and prayer. He woke with the sun and slept when night fell. His food was simple, often gathered from the land. His voice rarely spoke above a whisper because, for years, he rarely had anyone to speak to. Pietro's days were filled with contemplation, the kind of long, soft thinking that has no urgency and no fear. And in that silence, he found peace, a peace that followed him for decades, until one day, the world reached up the mountain and took that peace away. The church in the 1290s was troubled, torn by political tension, factions, and exhausted cardinals who could not agree on anything, including who should become the next pope. 2 years passed without a decision. The world waited. Kingdoms waited. Even the Vatican itself waited, drifting almost leaderless through time. Then word began to spread about a holy hermit, a man who lived apart from politics, apart from ambition, a man who seemed untouched by the chaos of the world, a man whose reputation for purity, simplicity, and sincerity had quietly grown like a rumor that swells with each retelling. So the cardinals gathered, and in a decision born from desperation, admiration, and perhaps a little wishful thinking, they chose Pietro da Moroni to be the next pope. Imagine the moment a group of noble riders reached his mountain hut, the sound of hooves breaking the forest silence, the rustle of robes, the crackle of the fire still burning beside his doorway, and Pietro, now an old man in his 80s, slowly stepping out to meet them. They told him the news in solemn voices that he had been elected pope, and he, in his steady, gentle voice, answered with disbelief, "I am not worthy." He didn't want the title. He didn't want the politics. He didn't want the heavy chain of responsibility that wrapped itself around every pope's life. But the church insisted. The world insisted. And Pietro, always humble, believed that refusal would be worse than acceptance. So the hermit descended the mountain, not on foot, as he had climbed it, but on a mule, surrounded by nobles, guards, and clergy. People lined the roads to watch the man who had spent so many years in silence. Some found him inspiring, others found him odd, but everyone could sense that he was different, unpolished, unprepared, and uninterested in power. When he reached the Vatican, the halls must have felt overwhelmingly large. Tall arches, busy footsteps, endless noise, echoing faintly off cold stone. And in the middle of it all, a man who had lived most of his life in a single-room hut, with nothing but prayer for company. Celestine V, as he soon became known, struggled from the beginning. He tried to rule with purity, but the Vatican was not a mountain hut. It was full of ambition, strategy, and negotiation. He was gentle where firmness was needed, hesitant where decisiveness was required, and those around him, especially powerful cardinals, quickly learned how to influence him. Yet he remained kind, deeply kind. He gave prisoners mercy. He offered forgiveness freely. He even allowed many people to come to him without barrier, believing that a pope should be accessible to everyone. But with each passing day, the responsibilities grew heavier. You can imagine how overwhelmed he must have felt. The endless letters, the disputes, the political pressures from kings and cardinals, the weight of representing millions of souls. Some nights, he retreated to a private chamber and prayed for guidance, hoping that God would lighten the world around him. But the world rarely softened for him, and slowly, gently, a realization began to settle in him, like snowfall accumulating on a quiet hillside. He was not meant to be pope. He never had been. His heart still belonged to the mountain. So, in one of the most startling acts in papal history, spoken softly, Vito Hut, Drama Celestin, V announced his resignation. A pope stepping down was unheard of at the time, but he did it not out of fear or scandal, or failure. He simply wanted to return to silence. He abdicated with a humility that stunned the church. And then, in the simplest gesture of all, he put aside the papal robes and walked away. But the story does not end in peace. The next pope, Boniface VIII, feared Celestine's existence. Not because Celestine sought power, far from it, but because some factions might try to use him as a rival. So Boniface had him gently confined, not tortured, not harmed, but enclosed, placed in a small room, watched closely, kept apart from the chaos of the world. It is said that Celestine did not resist. He accepted it with the same calm acceptance that had carried him through life. And in that stillness, he continued to pray, continued to listen to the quiet inside himself. When he died, people remembered him not as a great leader, but as a pure soul. Perhaps too pure for the turbulent world of the papacy, his story became a soft whisper through history, half admired, half pitied. A pope who never wanted the crown, a man who longed only for silence. A reminder that leadership, when unwanted, can weigh heavily on the shoulders of the gentle. As you let your mind drift over the details of his life, you might feel the soft echo of his story settling over you like a thin blanket. The image of the mountain, the little wooden hut, the man who preferred prayer to power, a pope who stepped down simply to be himself again, and softly, without hurry. The story of Celestine V carries us toward the next part of our journey, a place where forgotten papal mysteries linger, where archives whisper, and where history leaves quiet footprints. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside the Vatican, different from the silence of prayer, different from the hush of libraries, different even from the respectful quiet of a basilica at dawn. This silence is heavier, older, and shaped not by faith, but by hierarchy. It is the silence of the elite world, the cardinals, the advisors, the men whose robes sweep through halls the public rarely sees, and whose decisions ripple across centuries like stones dropped into ancient water. Tonight, Edmund walks with you into that quiet realm. Not to expose wrongdoing, not to chase rumors, but to observe, gently, how power behaves when cloaked in tradition, ritual, and the stillness of marble corridors polished by generations of careful footsteps. Because the Vatican's elite world is not loud, it never has been. Its existence depends on serenity, on intentional calm that hides the gears turning beneath. To understand the cardinals, you must imagine them not as individuals, but as constellation stars arranged carefully within the firmament of the church. Each one shines differently, yet together they draw shapes only the initiated can fully interpret. Their roles are ceremonial and political, spiritual and strategic, ancient and yet strangely modern. They move through spaces most people never realize exist. Internal courtyards where voices echo like they re-speaking to the past. Narrow staircases that twist upward toward meeting rooms lit by soft golden lamps. And galleries filled with portraits of men who once held the same power and now watch silently from painted eyes. In these places, history is not something you study. It is something you breathe. And with every breath comes the sense that decisions here are not made quickly. They are distilled slowly, like incense rising from an altar. Even a simple conversation between two cardinals can feel like a ritual, layered with meaning. A raised eyebrow might signal hesitation. A pause before answering might be an entire paragraph. And when a door closes behind them, it closes softly, but the silence afterward feels as though the hallway itself is listening. The elite hierarchy inside the Vatican functions like a complex mechanism, intricate, carefully balanced, and built on centuries of precedent. Every title has a weight. Every color of garment carries meaning. Every procession, every meeting, every seating arrangement in a chamber echoes with symbolism. There is an almost theatrical quality to it, though the cardinals themselves would likely smile politely and insist otherwise. Yet even Edmund, ever gentle, cannot help noting that when dozens of elderly men in red silk glide through a palace at dawn, it's hard not to imagine them as characters moving through a living painting. But beneath this elegance lies an unspoken truth. The cardinals inhabit a world where attention is currency, memory is power, and silence is strategy. For centuries, Their meetings weren't recorded. Their debates weren't transcribed. Their alliances were rarely written down. Power here traveled not through documents, but through whispers, through nods in corridors, small conversations over simple meals, through letters folded tightly enough to fit under a ring. And yet, for all the drama attributed to them in films and novels, the real daily life of a cardinal is deeply human. Many rise before dawn. Many walk the same gardens every morning. Some write compulsively, leaving behind diaries filled not with intrigue, but with reflections on scripture, small observations about the weather, or lists of books they want to read, though whether they ever found time to read them remains another mystery. Squared, one cardinal in the late 1800s recorded exactly how many times he misplaced his reading glasses. This number was impressively high. But beyond personal quirks lies a deeper, quieter reality. This elite circle carries the heaviest weight of continuity. They are the guardians of a tradition stretching more than 1,000 years. Every vote they cast, every decision they support, every document they review becomes another thread in the tapestry of the Church. Some cardinals take this with profound solemnity. Others carry it with mild exhaustion. A few, according to letters written by their assistants, coped by collecting small objects, coins, stones, pressed flowers, as if grounding themselves in the physical world could help balance the spiritual responsibility on their shoulders. And then there are the cardinals who've left traces, so subtle you could miss them entirely. A signature in an obscure ledger, a comment scribbled in the margin of a manuscript, a faint charcoal marking on a wall, left during construction, now hidden behind a centuries-old panel. These small marks remind us that the Vatican's elite are not only figures of authority, they are individuals navigating a life of immense pressure behind closed doors. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this world is how it moves without being seen. The average visitor touring the Vatican may pass dozens of cardinals without realizing it. Their paths are highly choreographed, their appearances strategic, their absence sometimes more meaningful than their presence. They inhabit rooms whose names shift depending on who speaks. The Red Chamber, the Apostolic Salon, the Room of Pale Maps, the Gallery of Quiet Steps. Many of these names are unofficial, whispered by staff who have spent decades navigating the palace. These quiet nicknames reveal something important: that the Vatican's elite world feels less like an institution and more like a living organism, breathing, shifting, evolving slowly but constantly. And yet, for all its complexity, this world is bound by a singular principle: humility. Not humility in the modern sense, but humility shaped by tradition, by the idea that power must move carefully, without spectacle, without noise. The elite silence of the Vatican is not emptiness. It is intention. As Edmund leads you toward the end of this segment, he slows his voice, allowing the weight of these hidden corridors to settle around you, like dust drifting through a stained glass beam of light. In the Vatican, he whispers, the loudest decisions are often made in the quietest rooms. There is a special kind of diplomacy that lives in the shadows of the Vatican, quiet, deliberate, and almost invisible. It is not the diplomacy of grand speeches or treaties signed beneath shadows. It is the diplomacy of whispered conversations, coded letters, subtle gestures, and long, contemplative pauses that say far more than words ever could. Edmund invites you now into this soft, clandestine world. Not a world of cinematic spies leaping across rooftops, but one built on patience, humility, and the remarkable ability to listen. Because for centuries, the Vatican did not merely observe world events, it absorbed them, and often it responded not with armies or proclamations, but with information carefully gathered, gently filtered, and quietly delivered. To understand Vatican espionage, you must first set aside the idea of espionage itself. Forget the gadgets, disguises, and dramatic musical cues. Vatican intelligence has always been shaped not by confrontation, but by relationship. It begins with people priests, diplomats, travelers, scholars, merchants moving through lands that were often unstable or unfamiliar. Some offered letters, some offered rumors. Some offered a simple passing comment about a change in a governor's mood, or a subtle shift in a distant king's tone, and all of it mattered. These individuals were not spies in the common sense. They did not sneak into enemy camps at midnight. They did not intercept coded messages with clever devices. They simply listened. They noticed. They remembered. And they trusted the church enough to share what they saw. One missionary in the 1500s even sent a report detailing the behavior of local goats in a remote mountain village, convinced it was relevant to regional politics. It wasn't, but the Vatican archivists still filed it away carefully. Because, well, you never know about goats. Why yet, beneath this gentle surface, Vatican intelligence formed one of the most extensive information networks in early modern Europe. By the 1600s, letters were arriving from nearly every corner of the world: Persia, Japan, Ethiopia, the Mongol steppes, the courts of France and Spain, and, later, the emerging cities of the New World. These letters, often written in fading ink by candlelight, were filled with tiny observations. The people speak of a new tax. The port is unusually quiet this week. A visiting merchant wears the colors of a family long thought absent. A rumor travels about a marriage that might shift alliances. Nothing was too small. Nothing was too mundane. In the Vatican's eyes, the world's movements were like the gears of a clockery. One meaningful Edmund pauses here, perhaps smiling gently as he reflects on the fact that some diplomats wrote so much that their letters arrived more frequently than their laundry. Squared, but even more intriguing than the information itself, was how the Vatican used it. Rather than forcing outcomes, the church often nudged them. Whispered advice to a wayward prince, a letter of concern sent to a distant bishop, a quiet suggestion offered to an ambassador. The Vatican's influence rarely arrived with the force of a command. It drifted instead like incense low, persistent, and difficult to ignore. This was especially true in moments of crises, when kingdoms teetered, when alliances strained, when rulers made decisions that threatened stability. The Vatican rarely acted loudly. Instead, it relied on the steady rhythm of correspondence, building a tapestry of perspectives before offering guidance. Some historians have compared the Vatican's intelligence network to a spider web, nearly invisible, but extraordinarily resilient. Edmund prefers a gentler metaphor. A pond touched by many raindrops. He whispers, each ripple creating meaning. There were, of course, moments when the whisper network brushed the edges of real danger. Priests in foreign courts sometimes reported plots against their lives. Envoys traveling through unstable regions occasionally vanished, leaving behind only half-finished letters. And there were times when a diplomat's quiet presence in a palace irritated local rulers who preferred secrets to remain secret. Yet even in these darker moments, Vatican strategy emphasized care over confrontation, protection over provocation, caution over risk. A fascinating example appears in letters from the 1700s, in which a papal emissary described the best way to avoid suspicion while gathering information. Blend in by walking slowly, talking little, and showing interest only in the weather. A technique that, honestly, might still work today. But the most profound part of the silent diplomacy was not the information gathered, it was the trust required to sustain it. Men and women across continents risked their comfort, their reputations, and sometimes their safety to share observations with people they might never meet. Many of them wrote with deep sincerity, believing that their letters could help prevent conflict, guide leaders, or offer clarity in confusing times. And often, they did. Within Vatican walls, archivists stored these documents with extraordinary care. Pages tied with ribbon, envelopes sealed and resealed, notes written in margins by cardinals who understood the importance of each fragment. You can almost imagine Edmund standing in those archives, running his fingers lightly along the shelves, whispering, every letter a heartbeat, every report a breath in the quiet body of history. As the centuries unfolded, the Vatican's whisper networks adapted. They became more formal, more structured, more diplomatic. But the essence remained unchanged. Today, many of these documents survive. Some are yellowed. Some are incomplete. Some are little more than fragments of parchment tucked into folders older than entire nations. Yet all of them share a common thread. They reveal a world where information shaped destiny, not through force, but through gentleness. The Vatican's power was never simply in its doctrine. It was in its listening. Now, As Edmund's voice softens toward the end of this segment, he invites you to imagine those quiet figures who traveled roads no one remembers, carrying letters no one saw, ensuring that whispers reached the right ears. They were not heroes. They were not villains. They were simply witnesses, and in a world where the loudest stories often overshadowed the quiet ones, their contributions remind us that history is not always shaped by volume but by intention. There is a certain stillness that settles over the Vatican after midnight, a stillness that feels older than the stones, older than the frescoes, older even than the stories we have wandered through tonight. If you were there, walking slowly beneath the gentle glow of lanterns, or listening to your footsteps echo softly through an empty courtyard, you would feel it immediately. The sense that centuries continue breathing quietly in the dark, and it is in that soft, ancient breath that this final segment lives. Because the legacy of these hidden papal stories of the forgotten popes, the quiet mysteries, the whisper networks, and secret correspondences, does not end in documents, or walls, or historical footnotes. Their legacy continues in something subtler, more human, more enduring. It continues in the idea that history is often shaped not by thunder, but by murmurs, not by the loudest rains, but by the gentle ones, not by the victories carved in marble, but by the decisions written quietly in letters that no one else would ever see, not by the popes remembered in textbooks, but by the ones remembered only by archivists who write their names in neat, careful handwriting. As Edmund guides you through this final reflection, his voice softens, almost fading into a whisper, as if he too is walking those quiet corridors. He speaks of legacy not as a bright flame, but as a candle whose glow lingers even after the wick is burned low. A legacy made of small acts, thoughtful letters, cautious decisions, long hours spent in contemplation, and the slow, steady work of governing a world of faith. These popes, the ones rarely mentioned, leave behind a reminder that history does not always reward subtlety, yet it is shaped by it all the same. Some popes ruled only briefly, their time in the papal chair passing like a sigh. Others lived without seeking influence, stepping carefully through their duties, leaving behind a trail so faint that modern historians sometimes wonder whether the trail existed at all. And yet, their quietness was a kind of strength. Edmund notes gently that in many ways, they were like gardeners tending a space no one else realized needed care. Why, you rarely notice the gardener, but you certainly notice the garden. And then there were the years shaped by whisper networks, the letters carried across seas and deserts, the diplomats who spoke softly so that peace might endure. Their legacy is quieter still. You cannot touch it. You cannot point to it directly. It lives in the absence of crises that never happened, the absence of conflicts that were quietly diverted, and the absence of disasters that diplomacy dissolved before they could form. It is strange, Edmund says with a small, reflective smile, how often historians must piece together what didn't happen. But that is the nature of gentle power. You feel it most when it leaves space, rather than noise. As you reflect on these centuries, you may notice something calming in the thought that the world has been shaped not only by grand dramatic figures, but also by men who moved softly, who acted slowly, who responded with care rather than force. These quiet pups remind us that leadership does not always require spectacle. Some lead through patience. Some lead through prayer. Some led through observing more than speaking. Some led by simply being present in times when the world needed a steady, grounded figure to anchor its chaos. And though their names are rarely recited with reverence, their effects ripple outward through centuries like gentle waves across a still lake. Edmund pauses here, perhaps amused by the idea that some of these popes worked so quietly that future generations may have accidentally overlooked their contributions simply because they were too polite to mention them. And beneath all of this, beneath the papal years, the archives, the sealed documents, the forgotten journals lies an even deeper legacy. The continuity of time itself. The Vatican stands not merely as a vault of secrets or a monument of faith, but as a reminder that life moves in patterns far slower, far more cyclical than we often remember. Every pope, whether famous or forgotten, stepped into a role that had existed long before them and would continue long after. Every letter, every whisper, Every quiet decision became part of a river flowing steadily through history. Some tributaries were grand, some were small. All were necessary, and in that realization, there is something profoundly soothing. Tonight, as Edmund brings this long exploration to a close, he asks you to imagine those quiet popes once more walking through dimly lit hallways, pausing by windows that overlook Rome, lifting their gaze to the same moon you see now. They lived in a world filled with uncertainty, political tension, and spiritual responsibility. And yet, day after day, they returned to stillness, prayer, contemplation, steady work, believing that the quiet path was often the wisest one. Perhaps that is why their stories feel so comforting when told slowly, in the soft hours of the night. They remind us that small actions accumulate, that silence can be purposeful, that the gentle touch of history is often the one that endures the longest. And now, as Edmund's voice begins to soften further, almost melting into the calm surrounding you, he offers a final reflection, a reminder that you are listening from a place of peace. Far from the storms and uncertainties that shape the lives of the men we've met tonight, history is filled with noise. But tonight, you have chosen the quiet parts. The soft pages, the dimly lit rooms, the stories whispered rather than proclaimed. And in doing so, you've discovered something beautiful, that even in the grand arc of centuries, it is the gentle souls, the ones who worked with care, humility, and silence, who leave the deepest marks. With that thought resting softly in your mind, Edmund slowly guides you toward rest, inviting your breath to settle, your body to grow heavier, and your thoughts to drift like incense rising into the darkness. The Vatican is far away now. The archives are closed. The popes are sleeping in their tombs, and you are free to drift into sleep, carried by the quiet legacy of history's softest voices.